So their coordination becomes important. These groups that exist, the primary group is our ventral respiratory group, the VRG. It's on a reverberating circuit. Anybody know what that might mean? It goes back and forth, like a cycle, just back and forth. I don't know about y'all, but I kind of like that because it keeps me breathing. I don't have to think about it. Can I affect this? Yes, I can affect this. My dorsal group gets affected by the external sources. Posterior helps to change the rhythm. So this is how our groups are going to work. When we talk about the control of breathing, we get the control, the rhythm, from the medulla oblongata. That gives us our rhythm. Now, when we begin to have this control, and I keep trying to hit the wrong computer, we have to have a signal. We have to have a stimulus. Stimuli are picked up by receptors. Receptors send the information to the brain. Right? Is everybody with me? The receptors that will affect the respiratory rhythm. Chemoreceptors. We have central ones and peripheral. Central, peripheral. Is everybody with me? Stretch receptors. Huh? What? Irritant. Huh? What? For the chemoreceptors, what do you think they're picking up on? Any other ideas? What is it that the body has to regulate very closely in the pH? Wait a minute. pH in the blood? What's that got to do with my breathing? My CO2. What have I got to do to that? We got to balance it. That means either increase my breathing or decrease my breathing. Anybody else just kind of going, huh? What? It's kind of cool if you think about it. Breathing being affected by the pH in the blood. That's kind of cool if you think about it. What about this stretch receptor? Smooth muscle, bronchi, bronchioles, pleura. The Herring-Brewer reflex, meaning as I breathe in, okay, there's a point that it says enough, and you won't be able to expand this cavity anymore, which is kind of cool. The irritant, the ones that are trying to get anything out that we have breathed in. The gas walls, and like I said, If you're going into respiratory therapy, you're going to get into these, all right? Your book does go into great detail. We don't have the time. Gas laws govern respiration. The gas laws that do this: Boyle's, Charles, Dalton's, Hendricks. Some of them, you kind of go, well, duh. I mean, you're like, really? Seriously? Boyle's. Pressure. Charles. Volume. Dalton. All the pressures. Henry's, the air-water interface. What can dissolve? Now, your book is going to get into a whole lot about those. Just know that there are these 4 laws that govern respiration. So here's what's going to happen when we go through a respiratory cycle. In the medulla, where we find the respiratory center, because we're on a reverberating circuit, the neurons are constantly active. We get a stimulus from a receptors and stimulus from parts of the brain. Because remember, there's central control, peripheral control. We have voluntary movements and then emotion. That's a good one. What are these? These are my higher order brain functions. All right? They will affect the breathing. All of that input creates the action potential. Now, we can incorporate more neurons. The stimulus is going to go to the respiratory muscles, the diaphragm, the skeletal muscles, okay? We'll do our respiratory movements, the stopping of the inspiration, basically saying, okay, we've taken in enough air, then some other stuff, like the Herring-Brewer, the stretch receptors, okay? The same neurons are responsible for stopping it. This is the purpose of a reverberating circuit. Start, stop, start, stop, start, stop. It doesn't, it's just this constant cycle that's taking place. We get the relaxation and we'll breathe out. There are some, we don't necessarily call them controls, but factors that affect breathing. And those factors are going to create resistance. Now, that's actually needed, believe it or not, but at the same time can become detrimental. Pressure is one of the factors. Resistance. The pressures are referring to the pressure outside the body versus the pressures inside the lungs that will begin to create respiration. Resistance. Well, the greater the resistance, the slower the flow of air. Sometimes not that good. Sometimes very important. It's governed by the diameter of the bronchioles. Why? What kind of muscle do we find in the bronchioles? Smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is innervated, and it's being innervated by the areas of the brain. Which system? We're gonna, well, if we got the sympathetic, we're gonna have to, okay. So, now we have these bronchioles that have the smooth muscle, okay, and their diameter is under that control. Does that make sense? So the diameter of the bronchioles, and then pulmonary compliance. The ease at which the lungs themselves and the thorax expand. Is there anything that can affect this ability?
Sure.
What?
8. The older you get.
Thank you.
Sorry. But like your muscles tense up and they're not.
Right. I mean, hey,
to be
we're not as flexible as we get older. That's a given. What else?
COPD.
COPD. All right. Asthma.
If you have something sitting on your chest.
How about like cancer? Okay. Diseases of the lungs. All right. Things that can affect the compliance. When we talk about the diameter of a bronchiole, bronchodilation, bronchoconstriction, hopefully they're pretty self-explanatory. Compliance. The greater the compliance, the easier it is to breathe. The less the compliance, the harder it is to breathe. Now, once we take in air, and air gets to the point of the alveoli, this is going to be termed alveolar ventilation. So now, let me think about this for a second. I've got my ventilation where I simply breathe in and breathe out. Now, I'm down into that little grate that exists, and this is going to have ventilation. Does that make sense? This is the volume of the air that's available for gas exchange per minute. Seems like everything is timed per minute. This is how we know that there are certain respirations per minute. In this ventilation, we're going to find that there is something called anatomical dead space. Anatomical is referring to what? The anatomy of it. Now, as we breathe in and out, not all of that air is at the point of the alveoli. Where's some of that air at? It's in that bronchiole, it's in my trachea, it's in my bronchi. That's air that's not getting used. So it's termed anatomical dead space. It's not air being exchanged at that respiratory membrane. Does that make sense? we have something called physiological dead space, the function of it. Basically, the air that's in the dead space plus any lack of gas exchange due to something. The function. Edema, for example. Fluid on the lungs. What's fibrosis? Scarring has taken place. Some kind of damage has occurred, and it's making that piece of the lungs as a whole not work. If that piece is not working, what's not taking place? We're not getting exchange. And that air will stay. Does that make sense?